This section will equip you with guidance on effectively performing transfers and lifts. Note that for all transfers, the educational assistant must encourage the student to assist as much as possible. Let's look at a one-person standing pivot, as shown in this example of a transfer from a wheelchair to a commode. You will note that as the student sits on the edge of the wheelchair, the educational assistant pauses to allow the student to adjust and ensure that the student's feet are positioned flat on the floor and knees at a 90-degree angle. The student helps by putting her hand on the nearest armrest. Notice as the educational assistant bends her knees to block the student's feet from slipping, places her hands over the student's waist. The student is leaning forward and ready to stand. Next, we see the student positioning her hand as the pivots occur. Now let's look at another example. In this case, a two-person standing pivot is used. Notice the assistant to the educational assistant stands between the commode and the wheelchair, behind the student. The educational assistant then grasps the student around the waist. As shown, the educational assistant assists the student to stand, and then pivots the student around and assists her to sit. Transfer discs are particularly useful for transferring students with difficulty shifting their feet in order to pivot. These devices may be used to facilitate both a one-person standing pivot and a two-person standing pivot. Watch as the educational assistant places the disc under the student's feet as she is positioned on the end of her seat. As you can see, it is necessary to ensure that both seating positions are approximately the same height. Note that during this transfer, the educational assistant positions the transfer board partially under the student's buttock so that the board is used to bridge the gap between the wheelchair and the other chair. Notice how the educational assistant slides the student across the board to the chair. A lift is a procedure used to carry the entire weight of the student from one surface to another. One person is designated as the leader and directs the lift. The parallel lift would be used if the surface to which the student is transferred does not have a removable armrest. We see that during this parallel lift, the educational assistants position themselves on either side of the student as the student places her arms over their shoulders. At this point, we note that each educational assistant places one arm behind the student's back and grips the other assistant's wrists. As each assistant places their other arm under the student's legs, they interlock their wrists and walk in step to the commode. Now let's observe an example of a front and back lift from the floor to a wheelchair. During this scenario, we note that the leader is positioned behind the student and assists her to sit up. At this point, the second assistant grasps the student's legs at the knees, and together the two assistants lift the student, step sideways, and place the student on the wheelchair. It is important to note that in order to avoid twisting, the leader moves directly behind the wheelchair. Let's turn now to an example of a front and back lift from a wheelchair to a commode. Notice how the leader assists the student to sit up in the wheelchair, leans her forward slightly, and grips her firmly. Pay careful attention to how the second assistant supports the student's legs with both hands under the student's thighs. Together, the two assistants lift and place the student on the commode. A collaborative assessment process is required to determine the most appropriate transfer and lift for a student. The assessment process may require the input of healthcare practitioners, community services, student services, principal, resource staff, teacher, parents, and the educational assistant. The assessment process takes into account the risk factors associated with the physical and behavioral aspects of the student, as well as the risk factors associated within the working environment.